Let us begin a new lesson that will help us to expand our knowledge. Today's topic is learners from indigenous groups.
What comes on your mind when you hear indigenous groups? Indigenous people, in other words, people who lived there before colonies or settlers arrived, defined new borders and began to occupy the land, are referred to as indigenous people. The Philippines, with a population of 14 to 17 million people, is a culturally diverse country. Indigenous peoples, or IPs, of 110 ethno-linguistic groups are primarily concentrated in northern Luzon, Cordillera Administrative Region 32% and Mindanao 61%, with some groups in the Visayas region. The Kalingo and Ibaloy of Luzon, the Magbanwa and Cagayanan of Visayas, and lastly, the Bukidnon and Mandaya of Mindanao are examples of indigenous groups. Let us move on to the Philippines, where historical accounts show that indigenous people, or IPs, have long faced discrimination and a lack of access to education. Why do you think that's so? Here is why. Let's talk about the challenges that learners from indigenous groups face. First is less access to education. Indigenous people have less access to and poorer quality education than other groups. Their education frequently does not include curricula and teaching methods that recognize their communities, histories, cultures, and pedagogies, traditional languages, and conventional wisdom. The second is poor educational quality, which I define as inappropriate teaching materials, a lack of Aboriginal role models, and most importantly, their primary language being too different from what educational institutions use, such as English. Another issue is their constant encounter with inclusion and marginalization. Many people of this generation feel as if these groups do not belong to the society. It is because of how old-fashioned their principles and practices are. I believe it becomes a problem for indigenous learners to deal with this type of people because they are known to be very sensitive. Instead of learning with us, they prefer to stay at home. The fourth is a lack of equal access to basic services. Most of the time, these indigenous groups do not have equal access to basic services because they are not prioritized for various reasons. It is truly unfortunate that many institutions prioritize wealthy people over those who are truly in need of their services. The last problem is that most indigenous parents are uneducated, which is obviously a problem because they cannot completely instill in their children the value of education. Most of the time, these parents would not encourage their children to go to school, partly because they cannot afford to send them to school, and partly because they are more concerned with protecting their heritage rather than allowing their children to be influenced by new things. Is there anything we can do to reduce indigenous people's marginalization? Certainly, and here are some ideas. To reduce marginalization, we must first build public awareness. It is our responsibility to educate the public that these indigenous people exist and must be respected and protected at all costs. Second, we must all remember that there is a human right to education. Let us all encourage our leaders to strengthen laws and policies that support indigenous people. A good example is the Republic Act No. 8371, which states that the state shall support all government programs intended for the development and rearing of children and youth, or IPs. The third is to build harmonious relationship with the IPs. It is necessity for us to make them feel accepted and important in society rather than discriminating and throwing unpleasant statements about them. Be friends with them and learn more about their culture in order to gain a better understanding. The final one is to recognize the right to education. The right to education is a fundamental human right that every individual, regardless of race, gender, nationality, ethnic or social origin, religion or political preference, age or disability, has the right to an education.